Hello and welcome to another episode of the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. I'm Owain. I'm joined by Dan. How are you doing, Dan?
Yeah, not bad, thanks. Tired. Parenting is tiring sometimes, isn't it? And I'm in my taper now for Seville at the time of recording. I've not done much running, so that's not the excuse. It's just a busy day of parenting, to be honest. But yeah, other than that, good.
You
Lovely
spend the day
day.
in you spend the day in the
Always,
aquarium, right? So that's going to tire you out.
yeah, it's just a lot of walking around, isn't it? And not enough sleep recently. Like child-related reasons, but it was fun. Lovely day, but just a bit worn down, run down. But looking forward to recording this at 8:30 at night, and probably going to bed too late again because that is parenting. I think been knackered and going to bed too late.
Summed it up.
How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, I mean I'm tired, but not parenting related. I've just another double threshold day, so another day of running for the entire day. It feels like, but yeah, no good. Yeah. Hopefully we see some daylight as well soon because it feels like I haven't seen the sun in a few weeks.
I saw that on the news. The average location in the UK has had 48 hours of sunlight since the start of this year, which is quite impressive, isn't it? Impressively bad. And about
Yeah,
a year's worth of rain, I think, as well.
I think sometimes the stereotypes of the UK are a bit overdone, but this year it has just been wet the entire start of the year, which is pretty. It's frustrating when you get home or you wake up in the morning and you're like ready to go run, and it's then just hammering it down with rain. It's sort of gets tiring at a point, I think.
It does just grind you down. And anyway, we're being stereotypical Brits now talking about the weather. So let's actually talk about what we're going to talk about today, which is wrapping up our series we've done on training intensity domains and training zones. So today is sort of a summary of what we've talked about over the last, 5 weeks, is it? 5 episodes? Feels like
this will be the fifth episode.
this is number 5. Yeah. So going through that and also just, I guess, going through the key themes, but wrapping it up and going, how do we actually apply some of this? How do we tie it all together into something usable for you, the listeners, to go over the mistakes people make in setting their training zones, but also how you can use the concept of training zones and intensity domains to have a better analysis of your own training and also having more purpose in your own training as well. So what is the aim of this session? What am I trying to achieve here? And then actually using that, reflecting on your training block and having an appreciation of what have you done? Did it work? Did it not? What can I change next time? So that's sort of the aim of what we're going to go through today. Before we get to that, we'll do a shout out to Saw. Owain he's going to talk to us about caps today. He's a big fan of the cap, Owain. He's even if it's raining, it's a cap. If it's sunny, it's a cap. He's pretty much in a cap every run he does. So he's going to tell us a bit about the Saw caps today.
Well, I'm feel bad. I'm going to talk about the weather again, but yeah, where it's been grim, that my Saw dark cap has been getting a lot of use to the point where I'm no longer in possession of my Saw cap. It's actually been stolen by my partner, who's decided that first of all that she looks good in it and that it works really well with her hair. Which is not a problem for me and you, Dan, but
it is for me. Look at, have you seen my hair?
I
need a haircut. I've got about 3 inches going here.
Yeah, it was actually. I mean, another shout out for Saw caps. Your one on Sunday managed to fit your hair under, so that was
my mop was hiding under. I tell you what. These days, when I've been doing treadmill sessions, I have to wear a hat because otherwise it's just dripping into my hair is just going into my eyes, going into my face, sweat's dripping everywhere. So I'm doing a really cool, cap on backwards look just to contain my the lawn that's growing on my head at the minute.
You need to go like full triathlete and wear like a headband.
Oh yeah, I need that precision fuel and hydration, don't I? Sponsor, so I can have one of the cool headbands. What do you reckon?
I think you'd look good. Maybe,
do you know that's in the contract? That is in the contract. If you're a precision fuel and hydration athlete, you've got to have a item of headwear, whether it be a cap or a sweatband, on every competition.
it's hard, isn't it? Because you then see, like if you're running in a road race, like you probably want the minimum possible. Assuming it's not raining or like in the sort of middle of summer, you probably don't want to wear much, do you? You want to wear your vest, your shorts, some socks. But anyway, we're getting sidetracked. No, my Sword Dark Cap has been great. Like, feels like it keeps the horrible weather off of my eyes, which is the main reason why I wear it when it's raining, because it actually feels like you're not just getting like wind and rain sort of blasted in your eyes, especially at night or when it's dark. So yeah, I'm a massive fan. I think it just makes a huge difference. It makes it, again, slightly more bearable to get out, and I think it looks like a cool cap. You're a fan of the pattern.
Yeah,
um
I'm jealous of yours actually. I've got some saw caps and I like them. They're like super super lightweight, but they haven't got as long a rim and as long as rigid a rim, which is good and bad. I think it's great if it's if it's more for sun protection and you want something super lightweight. But if you're after rain protection, you want a bit more, yeah, it jetting out a bit more. So that's in the next order for me. I think another one of
yeah,
those caps.
yeah, they look good. I mean, like, even you wore the printed run cap on Sunday, and I thought like the color on that's really cool. It's like a red sort of fade.
I
um
got it to match my Welsh Athletics kit, you see,
yeah,
for Valencia. But
yeah.
I didn't actually wear it in the end.
But yeah, I think it's a nice accessory, I reckon. Like, yeah, a nice, cool looking cap. You look good when you're running, keeps the rain off your eyes. You look cool when you're getting a coffee after. I think that's
And
that basically.
if you're like me and you needed a haircut about 2 months ago,
Yeah,
then it's great for just hiding the bonnet,
right.
just the mop.
The bonnet.
Yeah,
Yeah, but yeah. Checkout store as always. Thank you for the support and the really good kit. We're yeah, always loving it. Always loving life. Pulling on some saw gear in the rain. But yeah, should we get onto our topic?
yeah. Well, I'm just gonna do a quick plug for
Oh yeah,
Patreon. Selfishly, just gonna do a quick plug for Patreon. If you like our tangents, what we always go off on, and that is the main reason you're listening to the show. Like, the science is all right, but you love us as personalities, which I don't. You probably need a screw tightening up somewhere if you do. But if that's what floats your boat, then go check us out on Patreon. We've got a couple of series going at the minute. We've got one which is Owain and Jen talking about their road to, well, Jen on the road to Rotterdam, and Owain has got a race coming up too. We're not quite sure which one it's going to be yet. We've got a couple of races, but probably by the time this goes out, people will know what we're talking about. And myself and Jake Smith, Maverick Jake Smith, who ran 2:11 in the marathon. It was supposed to be pacemaking and had, I think, 2 gels. Just decided to finish off and win the race. Is myself and him are talking about our roads to the London Marathon, where he is hoping to qualify for the European time and probably it being that top 3 Brits at the London. And I will see how I'm doing post Seville, but we're giving it a good go before, just making the most of the ability to race a world-class field and hopefully enjoy and make the start line of London after not, I'm going for some redemption, to be honest. I would like to just have a solid run at London and actually make the start line and the finish line, hopefully under 2:20, which is something that's eluded me the last few times I've raced in the capital. So if you want to hear about that, then go check us out on Patreon, link in the show notes. And for those who are supporting the show, really, really appreciate your support.
yeah. Appreciate it as always. Cool. I think to start with, we were going to very quickly cover the previous episodes and the previous intensity domains, weren't we? So should we take these in turns? Do you reckon?
Yeah, go on then.
Yeah.
You can start us off.
Yeah, so the moderate intensity domain, that's anything below the first lactate threshold, first ventilatory threshold. That is where there is no rise in sort of your baseline, I guess, metabolic response is sort of an all-encompassing way to put it. So lactate levels aren't going to rise above baseline. Your heart rate's going to go up, but it's going to plateau like pretty quickly within a minute or two, and just remain there for hours. Over time there's going to be some drift, but for the amount of time that anyone's going to be running outside of an ultra, it's going to remain there. Everything's going to remain stable. Your lactate at the start and the end of a run is going to be the same for many hours. So that's where most people are doing most of their running.
This is your zone 2 zone,
So,
you know,
yeah.
your zone. This is where zone 2 and zone 1, depending on what model you're using, are sitting. And like you said, really nice stable physiology, good mix of fat and carbs as a fuel source, pretty much exclusively slow twitch muscle fibers. Basically easy.
Yeah. Well, I think as we covered in the episode, there is still quite a wide range, which when we get onto the zones is part of the thinking behind them. There's a lot of scope for sort of a lot of different, I guess, absolute intensities in that range as well. But that's the moderate domain.
Nice. Yeah, I'll take us on to the heavy domain then. And this is what I would just call that threshold domain. You're running an intensity where lactate's gone up above your resting levels. It's not going to be 1 millimole anymore, but it's going to remain stable over the course of that run. So, and it's going to be a quasi steady state. So lactate might drift up slowly, but it's not drifting up every minute, every couple of minutes. It's going to, maybe over the course of a marathon, then you're going to see some slow drift in your lactate, but it's pretty stable. And the same is true of heart rate. Again, you're going to see drift, but it's not the same level of drift that you see at higher intensities. And you could look at muscle pH, you could look at breathing rate, you could look at oxygen consumption. You have this slow component, but things are reasonably stable. And these are sort of intensities that you could sustain for, excuse me, somewhere in the region of, I would say, like 3 hours to an hour. You're talking about, depending on the level of the athlete you are, but marathon to half marathon-ish pace, broadly speaking.
Yeah, and this sits between your LT1 and LT2, or lactate turn point, or critical speed. We're going to do an episode on that, right? Because that comes up a lot as its sort of own term and own topic. But yeah, it's sort of surrounded at either end by those two thresholds, which make it quite nice. And, assuming you had a lab test, makes it quite nice and clear where that intensity domain sits. Shows up in research as well, doesn't it? Sort of the either end of the heavy domain. And then severe domain. So this is above that second threshold, or above your lactate turn point, or above critical speed. This is an unsustainable intensity domain. So in this domain, heart rate, VO2, lactate is just going to keep on rising. You're not able to maintain this intensity for very long. I'd say 15-20 minutes, or tops, maybe a little longer if you're sort of right at the bottom of it, but it's not sustainable. You're just going to see an ongoing rise in the metabolic cost of existing in this intensity domain. I guess sort of start to really, really utilize the sort of fast twitch muscle fibers as well. All systems go, I guess, once you're in the severe domain, right?
Yeah, like pretty much exclusively relying on carbohydrate metabolism, and it's not a core case of like, are you going to fatigue? It's when are you going to fatigue? You're talking about fatiguing in minutes rather than like hours now. So you're going to see you can just feel when you're working in this zone, but every mile is getting progressively harder. I'm thinking like a 5K, 10K. You're working. You can feel that progression in fatigue. It's not like I'd say a half marathon where, obviously it's getting harder as the race goes on, but actually you can have good spells and bad spells, and sometimes actually that middle K feels pretty good, and then starts to go downhill a bit. So then lastly, we've got the extreme intensity domain, which is an intensity that's above VO2 max, which is the key break point between severe and extreme. And the key fatigue response in this domain is that you fatigue before you get to VO2 max. There's so much metabolic byproducts, waste, pH drops, hydrogen ion accumulation, that your peripheral fatigue is occurring at such a great rate that you can't actually sustain the intensity for long enough for your aerobic system to gear up and for you to get to VO2 max. So now we're talking about things like probably like the 800 meters and down, really. The 800 meters is, for me, is that devise. You're going to be at VO2 max most likely at the end of an 800 meters. But if you're in a 400 meters, you're not going to get to VO2 max at the end. You're going to be at pretty high level, but that peak is probably going to occur after you've finished. And it's not the main reason you slow it down. It's because of that rapid and sustained accumulation of hydrogen ions and decrease in your ability to regenerate ATP quick enough. So those are the intensity domains. A quick wrap up and summary. I guess now we need to talk about how do you map training zones onto those domains, which I guess I'll start. I mean, there's an assumption there. If that's what you should do, maybe we should explain that assumption first. Do you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, I guess maybe let's like acknowledge a bit of bias, right? A bias, and I don't know. I don't want to call it privilege because I don't think it's that, but like we both have access to lab testing, right? So we actually have access to these like anchor points that you sort of, I guess, hang training zones off of. Obviously, it's a little harder if you don't have that data, but I guess we should probably talk from that perspective. But yeah, I guess the reason for doing so is that the anchor points, and the anchor points we're talking about are LT1, LT2, and then VO2 max. Those are fairly easily reproducible. If you want to get really, maybe again it's a whole episode in itself, but there's plenty of arguments in the physiology world about how you actually, there's not really there's a gold standard for VO2 max. It's more argued on the other ones, but you can fairly easily reproduce them in a lab, and there is some discreteness to them. It's not completely discrete, but they do sort of, I guess, I don't want to say stand out in a test, but they're generally fairly obvious. So that's I guess the best sort of method of having an anchor point, right, is something that you can fairly clearly see, and how that manifests itself with regard to your physiology. So at LT2 you can see that, if we're doing a lab test and we see 17 kilometers an hour, your lactate has just like spiked at that point. The curve has just really sharply gone up. So we're saying that's where your LT2 is, and like that roughly that heart rate is where your LT2 is. We know then that you're probably not going to be able to run much more than an hour at that pace. And for some people it might be 50 minutes, for some people it might be 70 minutes, but that's fairly clear. Whereas if you went a kilometer an hour slower, it could be a much wider range of what could be achieved. And the same with LT1. And yeah, I guess the same with VO2 max as well. So they're the best anchor points we have for then hanging these zones off of, with the caveats that they're not, I guess, perfect by any means either.
Yeah. And like the reason why that scientists like intensity domains is because they're predictable. You have a predictable response dependent upon what domain you're in. As we just talked about in my introduction, if someone's in a moderate intensity domain, what you're going to see in terms of lactate, fat, carbohydrate oxidation rates. You know what the fatigue mechanism is most likely to be when you're working in that zone, and you can have a pretty good stab at what you think that stimulus is. You know what you're taxing physiologically when you're working in the moderate, the heavy, the severe, the extreme domain. So they're predictable. And the whole idea is that if you do training in a given domain, you're going to get a predictable physiological response acutely, and long term that is going to manifest as a predictable training adaptation. And that's how training studies are done, which are well controlled and well designed studies, is that they're going to give somebody a training session that is designed to be in a specific domain. Instead of using X percentage of heart rate, they should be calibrated against that own individual athlete's physiology. And so when we want to use training zones, that's why it really makes sense to anchor them around these same intensity domains, because that's what we're looking to achieve. We want to know, what physiological response am I going to get from working in my zone 2, for example? What does that look like acutely? And also, what are the training adaptations that's likely to lead to long term? And also, I think importantly, what is the cost of working in that zone? Because you are going to have a predictable level of fatigue coming out of a heavy domain session versus a severe domain session. And, there are not, we're talking about it like there are distinct boundaries, and like now you're moderate and now you're in heavy. Probably more likely we can be 95% confident you're in a moderate intensity domain, and there's going to be this sort of gray zone when you're in more of a transition period and you're going to get a bit of a both stimulus. But that doesn't get away from the fact that intensity domains and anchoring your training zones around these discrete physiological landmarks makes sense in terms of just predictability and knowing what you're getting basically from a certain session.
Yeah, and I guess that maybe goes into a discussion about about actually undertaking a training session. Whether that's an easy run or a threshold session. If you're doing like 10 by a K, you probably don't want. I think we've talked about this. You don't want to just your LT2 heart rate, just get up to it and just stick there as long as possible. Like, that's probably not the best way, and I don't think that's necessarily not the best way in terms of like actual execution of the session, but also from a physiological perspective. It's not a black and white, like this is your LT2. Like mine generally comes out around 175, but there's some tests where it's been 174, there's some where it's been 177. I've done half marathons where I've averaged 177 BPM. So, there's then the sort of like what we say is like the smell test of like, does this actually line up with what you've seen in reality as well? But then that's going to be impacted by your fatigue levels, by your sort of chronic training fatigue, by your acute fatigue. If you've had a bad night like you have, then maybe your threshold's a beat or two lower. If it's really hot, if you're doing your session on the treadmill indoors and you're sweating buckets, maybe your threshold's a bit lower. So it's not necessarily a just get it right up to that heart rate and sit there. There is some like nuances to it as well, and that's why we talk about them being discrete, right? It's not just here's a line and everything changes after that. It sort of gradually goes over the course of a number of beats per minute, sort of either side.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's dive into that a bit more. I was probably going to save that for a little bit later, but I think actually now we're here. That is I think it is important that people have an appreciation that although we're talking about it in there are 4 different domains, it is to an extent a spectrum, or at least there is a transition phase between the different zones. And I am definitely guilty, and it's one of my reflections of my recent training blocks of, right, my LT2 heart rate is 170. I'm going to drive it up to 170 every session and toe the line and make sure I don't go 171, but also that I'm spending a lot of time in that 168 to 170 region. And I'm the same, but my LT2 is typically somewhere between 169 and 172 when I get a lab test, but I'm normally going to those reasonably fresh. And I know that if I'm fatigued, and this is not just me, this is commonly seen in athletes that are not necessarily overtrained, but are heading in that direction, we see the suppression of our sympathetic nervous system, and there is a disassociation between that lactate and heart rate relationship. The heart rate is just not as high as it probably should be because we're not having as big an adrenaline response. And so we get this suppression in heart rate. And I've seen it in my own training recently where my lactate is continuing to rise as if I'm in the severe intensity domain, but my heart rate's only 165, which is probably a sign that maybe I'm overdoing things, but certainly that I'm carrying some sort of fatigue, whether that's sleep deprivation or just doing too much training. That's when you need to go and probably dive into your situation in a bit more detail. But I think a good message is to say you have got physiology data, aim for the middle of the zone. If this is a threshold session, don't try and flirt with the edges of it becoming more of a severe intensity domain session above threshold. Just aim for the middle. That is then you're going to be 95% confident that you're working in the right place. Whereas if you're really teasing the edges of where your threshold zones have come out as from a lab test, even if they are accurately calibrated and measured, then chances are you're going to be just edging into a different intensity domain.
Yeah, I think that's the more safer and sustainable way to train, isn't it? And there's not going to be an appreciable difference in training response in a week or in a month or 6 months if you're doing your session at, if you average 168 BPM or 170 for those reps, like there's you're not going to be able to see a difference. Like there won't be a difference. You're still inducing the same physiological response to that training effort, and the interval in the moment, it's the same physiological response whether you're right at the limit or just below it. But it probably then is just that bit safer. It's not sort of, like you say, flirting with the danger of all of the other aspects of life that impact on your training and your sort of physiological response to a training session or to just life in general, right?
Yeah, and I don't think, inherently that's not bad. It's just because it's not going to change the stimulus massively or the fatigue associated with it massively. But I feel that just long term, you aren't giving your body exactly what you think you're giving your body. You're not giving it the same stimulus. And for me, I really like sessions that are, this is the stimulus that I'm after today. This is a threshold session. I'm going to keep it as a threshold session. And actually, when I'm going to do a more VO2 max type session or a severe intensity domain session, I want to specifically target that. I might do a bit of threshold work as part of a warm up, but the purpose of that session is to work harder. And I just think it takes away from the clarity of what you're trying to achieve on that day, what you're trying to get out of that session. And then it's a bit like, it's not quite as extreme, but when somebody's new to starting running and they just go out and run moderately hard every day, there's nothing really purposeful about it. You just end up with a fair amount of stress, but not super hard, but not super easy every day. And we know that that's not the optimal way to approach things. So yeah, I like, with both myself and the athletes I coach, to be reasonably pure in the stimulus, what I'm trying to go after that day. And if you're always trying to flirt with the edges of that intensity domain, then you're sort of always at a hybrid between threshold and VO2 max type stuff.
Yeah, and I guess we're talking about it in terms of, like, the top of LT2, but I think it also happens in the moderate intensity domain, and maybe this will segue into training zones. But we said when we were recapping a few minutes ago, that the difference between being at the top of the moderate domain and some way down it, I guess it's hard to quantify like where the middle and bottom of those are, but the difference between being right up at LT1, a couple of beats below it, and 20 beats below it is a lot. Like, I know if I'm just below LT1, like, I'm having to think quite a lot about the session or the run. I think we talked about it during the whole moderate domain podcast that like, I get to a traffic light and I'm like, yeah, I wouldn't mind if this was red. Like, I wouldn't mind if I had to stop for 30 seconds. You don't physiologically need the stop, but it's just like a bit of a all encompassing, like, fatiguing effort. Like, there's some fatigue about it. Whereas if you're 20 beats below your LT1, you're just like jogging. You're just like, yeah, I'll just keep going, sort of thing. Like, you just keep cruising. There's no sort of mental strain from that effort. At least for me, I'm just completely not zoned out, but just I have all my mental capabilities about me. I can take in my surroundings and I'm really relaxed. Considering that I'm running, I'm really relaxed. And I think that's important as well, in terms of there can still be quite an appreciable difference between being at the top and being at the bottom of, or the middle of these zones. And where, like, RPE can sort of really help with that, was the point I was trying to get to. So I know, again, just literally speaking from experience, an hour ago when I was doing my session this evening, I was 4 or 5 beats below LT2, but RPE wise, I was like, I don't want to go any faster than this. This is a 7 to 8 out of 10, and that's where having 2 or 3 guides, so heart rate being the obvious one when we're talking about intensity domains, but then anchoring that to RPE and pace is also really important as well. And you mentioned it in terms of getting your heart rate up to LT2. Maybe the RPE wasn't aligned in the same way that it normally is, and you're actually pushing harder than maybe you want to, but the heart rate's saying it's okay. So keep going. And I think, yeah, it's always important to just, I think that's maybe something else to introduce as an application of this is try and really try to calibrate RPE to heart rates and where they sit in the zone as well.
100%. Yeah. I mean, heart rate and lactate, I think, are just one more tool to help guide and calibrate your own RPE, to be honest. And I think RPE probably should be your overriding tool, because if it feels hard, it is hard, regardless of what your heart rate is saying. Your brain isn't misinterpreting that. Maybe it's like muscle damage, maybe it's fatigue, maybe it's just chronic fatigue, maybe it's stress. Your brain is a supercomputer. It is taking into account all of these messages and stimuli from the rest of the body, and giving you gives you the ability to just go, right, where am I on a 1 to 10 scale? Your brain can process that and go, actually, I'm a 7. And most of the time, for me, if I'm going for a threshold session, I don't want to be above a 7, really. This one's maybe a 7.5. But if my lactate's saying it's a threshold session, or my heart rate's saying it's a threshold session, but it's a 9 out of 10 effort, then that is going to take more time to recover from. There's going to be more costs associated, and you probably need to dig into your own training history about why that is. But it is a red flag that something's off. Going back to like the moderate and easy stuff as well, when I give athlete an LT1 heart rate, I say, this is where your LT1 is. And I always explain to them that is a cap for your zone, the top of your zone 2. This isn't a target. This is a cap. Like, this is an absolute limit. Do not go above that number. And actually, probably stay 5 beats away from it, 10 beats away from it on most of your runs, unless it's a very deliberate stimulus, because then you know that you're not going to stray above it.
Yeah, and I think also when it comes to, I guess I don't want to say typical, because everyone's is different, but if you're doing a couple of sessions a week in a long run, you're probably actually fairly rarely going to be there anyway, just because you're either going to be intentionally going harder than that in a session, or you're just going to be, jogging around zone 2. Just getting in an easy effort. And if I again, just from personal experience, like if I was up there, I'd just fatigue really quickly. At the same time, if you're doing, there's been times where I've done 1 session a week, and then you can go a bit harder. So there's, I guess where it comes to application, there's like, if you push in one domain, I guess if you push one domain up, then maybe like the other domains are sort of seeing less use. There's lots of sort of applications, but I guess it's just an interesting sort of observation that you have these training zones, but actually some of them you spend like relatively little time, sort of near either end, or you have a zone, but you actually spend a lot of time in just one part of the zone rather than the whole thing. Maybe that's a good way to actually bring in some training zones.
Yeah, I was going to say that. Let's start then with mapping on a training zone system onto the domains, because we've already mentioned about why domains are great, but actually they have their limitations in that some zones are really wise. And I think the biggest example of that is the moderate intensity domain, which for anyone who's reasonably well trained is a really large zone. It goes from, I guess, existing at the bottom end of the zone all the way up to probably about, I'd say typically 75% of VO2 max. So if you think of like a percentage of VO2 max range, 75% of your, yeah, of your available intensities that you can work at is moderate intensity domain, and only 25%, well, 25% then is heavy and severe, and then you've got, depending on how much room above, how much anaerobic capacity you've got, is going to determine how big your extreme domain is. But that could be quite large as well, depending upon the type of the athlete. So practically then, it makes sense to break up the moderate intensity domain. I think we should work through it, do you reckon, from moderate all the way up, and how we divide it? I mean, the example for me, my LT1 is actually closer to 80% of the O2 max typically, because I've done high volume training for 15 years, and I'm so exclusively slow twitch muscle fiber type that ULT1 tends to sit a little bit higher then. So anything from walking up to running at 320 a K pace is all the same zone. But practically, that's obviously running at 330 K pace and running at 5-minute K pace is not the same in terms of the cost and fatigue. So I think that's when training zones are useful, even though there's no physiological break point in that intensity domain. It just makes sense to break it up into more manageable bites.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, yeah. Like we said, this it's so big. Just yeah, applying training and yeah, getting meaning from a session is easier when it's at least two zones. I feel like you could make the argument that you could probably break it up into three, but maybe we won't do that here. I haven't done it, but I don't know. I reckon this is one way you have these anchor points, and then maybe you like look at your training and you think, okay, like what's the like utilization of this in reality? And I guess that's the way to approach training zones, isn't it? Is how does my training actually look, and how can I better control my training with some extra boundaries, I guess. Boundaries that are generally going to be derived from a bit of experience, a bit of sort of guesstimation as well, and then like reflected upon as well. I think that's an important thing to mention as well. Is like, don't just set zones and like just completely forget about them. Like, have a look at them. Like if you're going out and running and you're like right on the edge of two zones all the time, and you're seeing like 50-50 in either zone, and you actually want it to be, you're planning the session to be different, like maybe like reflect and think, okay, like is this boundary in the right place? But yeah, so I guess dividing up the moderate domain into zone 1 and zone 2, right, is what most people are going to do. How do you go about doing that?
Yeah, I think, well, how I go about it is just, I randomly chose a number 10 years ago and I've just stuck with that number. So my LT1 is typically 155 beats per minute, and I've set the top of my zone 1 as 135. So it's a 20 beat range, and I think that's a good starting point. You want a zone that's not 5 or 10 beats wide. Like 20 beats is usable. You can, if I go out for a run, typically all my runs are what I would call zone 1, and I'm not going to spend 0 minutes in zone 2. And that's not about me. I'm not staring at the watch to make sure I don't end up in zone 2. I'm just going out by feel and spending the whole time in zone 1. And equally, I could go out and I'm going to do a zone 2 run, and I might have like 5 minutes at the start where I'm working through zone 1 up to zone 2, but then I could just, from feel, just anchor and be in zone 2 without staring at my watch the whole time. So I think that's a good starting point. But it's also, like you said, I think anchoring it to RP as well. You want to be able to feel a difference. And for me, I am probably a 1, maybe 2 out of 10 on all my easy runs, and that will get me in zone 1. If I'm in zone 2, or how I've set the boundary of my zone 2s, then I'm probably a 3 to 4, maybe getting to a 5 if I'm really approaching my LT1. And that's why I typically see LT1 sitting. When I've tested people in my lab, I would say that LT1 is normally a 5 out of 10. Yeah. So that's how I go about it.
Yeah, I didn't quite choose the numbers randomly for me, but But no, so I think my OT ones come out somewhere between like 162 and 164 BPM. Um, and it is, I then set my boundary. I've changed mine, which is something we disagree on as well. Like I've slowly changed mine over time, whereas you sort of are adamant about sticking with them. But I I've set mine at 145 BPM, which is still close to 20 beats below. But for me, I know that if I'm running below 145 beats per minute, um, I am like mentally and physically like pretty relaxed. Um, and the thinking for me is if I, so tomorrow morning I'll go out and jog, and I did a double threshold session today, or double threshold sessions. And if I'm feeling really fatigued from that, like I'm probably going to be right in the bottom of zone 2. And I sort of know it. I just know, like instinctively, I'm like, okay, like it's just a bit of a slog this morning, and like I'm not quite mentally relaxed, and I sort of want my zone to reflect that. And I've found that boundary is quite good. And then if I go out tomorrow morning and I'm like, I actually feel really good, and it's maybe it's not raining, it's a nice morning. My heart rate will probably be below 140 for the whole run, and I know, yeah, okay, that RPE wise during and then sort of how I feel after reflects quite well as well. And I've just sort of through a bit of trial and error found 145 lined up quite nicely. I would say it has changed. It's gone slightly up over time. Like I found 5-6 years ago, I would be like plodding around on my easy runs and like my heart rate wouldn't go above 140. And it's just sort of, it's crept up over time. I noticed it when I got like quite badly ill a few times. Like it just then, I just like basically had like 2 years where I couldn't get my heart rate below 140 really on an easy run unless I was like shuffling, like barely moving. That's changed in the last like year, but that was part of it as well. I had this boundary and I was like, I can't actually run below that, but my RPE was fine, so that was why it changed. So that was the RPE guiding where I put a heart rate zone. But yeah, that's how I've sort of come about it. I think, I don't know, I think that kind of, if you feel completely relaxed and, like literally for me, like if it's sunny, if it's daylight, I'm like, like, oh, what birds do I see sort of thing. Like that's the sort of like mindset I'm in an easy run. Then that's the guideline for me, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I think that makes sense. I'm going to defend my holding it steady at 135, that LT1 LT2 dividing, but it just allows me then to compare a training block to a training block I did 5 years ago, 10 years ago. So if I just leave my zones on Training Peaks or whatever platform I'm using, I know that I can compare like with like. Whereas if I'm changing my zones all the time, then it's not a fair comparison. Right?
Yeah.
If I've played around with what is zone 1 and what is zone 2. If I was going to do it again, go back, I would probably drop it down to a 130 as that LT1 that zone 1 zone 2 breakpoint. But 5 beats here or there, I'm not that bothered.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference in terms of like reflecting over time. Like, okay, this is slightly changed, rather than like every 3 weeks changing it. Like definitely don't change it every 3 weeks. Like I've made one change in 6 years. And I think that was a worthwhile change, but that took, I was thinking about it quite a long time, putting a lot of mental thought to where have I put this boundary, thinking like, how would I explain this to someone that's not a runner, that I'm spending all this mental energy on this. But yeah, like definitely don't be changing it every 2 weeks. That's a recipe for disaster, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's where we put zone 1, zone 2, and there's probably no right or wrong way to divide up those zones. I mean, there probably are wrong ways, but there's no perfect way. If you've got a zone that's only 5 beats wide, then that's obviously a bit idiotic, because that's not going to tell you anything. You want it to be usable and practical. But I think it's important to know that physiologically, in terms of like the lactate response, there isn't much of a difference. There's not a clear break point. I think one of the questions that always comes up is, well, should I be in zone 1 or zone 2? And it probably depends upon how much running you're doing. For me, I found that I can go and run 200k weeks if I keep all my easy stuff in zone 1 or my zone 1. But if I was trying to do all that work in zone 2, I wouldn't be able to do that mileage without compromising those harder sessions. So I think that is where you run your easy days. It's just a bit of experimentation, there's certainly an interaction with how much mileage you're doing, because the closer you do go to LT1, the more carbohydrate you're going to burn, the more muscle damage you're going to induce. And yeah, there's not going to be a massive spike like going from like heavy to severe domain to domain in terms of the like stress hormone response, for example. But there is going to be a more subtle graded response. And because you're doing so much training in that intensity domain as well, it is going to add up over the course of a week. When I used to run faster on my easy days, but I was doing like 120k instead of 200k a week. So there's definitely this interaction effect, and it's very much, this is where you can be your own experiment and go, what allows me to put out good weeks consistently? Because there's probably not much of an advantage of running in zone 2 versus zone 1, but there is going to be a bit more fatigue. Obviously, you are going to get a little bit more benefit, but not drastically a huge amount more. So that's why I think we see that actually overall volume becomes more important as an athlete becomes more experienced and able to handle that volume.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that interaction of how much time you spend running and then like we said earlier, like how much time you spend doing higher intensity running as well, then influences the amount of time you spend and where you spend that time, zone 1 and zone 2 wise as well, doesn't it? Like we sort of talked about when we did the heavy and severe episodes, like you want to get that training, that's like the priority with the training, and then the easy running, the zone 1 zone 2 running fits around it, and that's where it fits around it, and it's influenced by that high intensity running. Like, you know, I had 4 months a year and a half ago where I didn't do any sessions because I was really busy for a few months, and I there was runs where I'd be right at the top of right up at LT1 because I was just not doing sessions. I was just running once a day. You know, some days was an hour and 20 minutes, some days was an hour. And yeah, I'd go smash a few runs at basically at LT1 because I was absolutely fine the next day. Like there was no issue. Whereas if I'd been doing double threshold at that point, you know, there's no way I would have been doing that running. So yeah, definitely interacts, doesn't it? And considering zone 2 is the one that gets all the airtime, I think we said in the zone 2 episode as well, like the higher intensity stuff should dictate that rather than the other way around.
Yeah, absolutely. There's interactions everywhere. Everything interacts. That's why it's not as clear cut as just do all your stuff in zone 2.
Interactions, feed forward, feedback.
Yeah, all those buzzwords, right?
Yeah.
So let's move through into the heavy intensity domain. So we're not going to spend another 20 minutes talking about how you define your LT1 because we've done a whole episode on that already, and we could end up just literally repeating ourselves and this episode being 4 hours long. So, but I think my one comment I would say is if you're using Garmin zones and you're to set your zone 2, for example, and you're finding you just can't work in that, you can't run slow enough to keep your heart rate in zone 2, your zones are just wrong, right? Use RPE. That is your starting point if you haven't been to a lab. And I would say easy stuff. It should feel pretty comfortable. And if you're going to put a number on it, being under a 5 out of 10, probably more like a 1, 2, 3 rather than a 4 or 5 out of 10 on your easy days. That would be my guide for top of zone 2, like 4 out of 10 absolute maximum. Heavy domain then, so that threshold intensity domain, lactate is elevated but will remain stable over the course of a run, spans from LT1 to LT2. You divide this up, right, into 2 zones. Let's hear about how you go about it then. and you
Yeah, I
rush
mean,
down.
I mean, you've just said you just took 20 beats off of LT1 for zone two. I divide this zone in basically into half. There was some for my own personal zones. There was some thought into or some application of like real world data in terms of what I've seen my heart rate be during marathons. But my thinking was that the RPE and the work that I'm able to do in the bottom half of the heavy domain is really different to the top half. Um, with the caveat, obviously, around where I divide these zones up, it's basically the same. But if you're talking at the extreme ends, at one end, I've run a 40-mile track race, and at the other end, I've run a half marathon. So to me, that's like a massive difference. And I think it's worth then dividing up the zone. And I think really for me, it just means that I can apply the training a bit better. So I'll typically, if I'm doing if I'm doing a big marathon session, like, 3 by 4 miles, I'll be in my zone three, which is from LT1 to basically the halfway point between LT1 and LT2. I'll be there because I don't think I can actually complete the session if I'm running much harder. Maybe if I'm in my super shoes and it's, like I'm really well fueled and like maybe a bit tapered, like, yeah, it'd be okay. But actually for me to complete the session, especially like when I train, I think that's just a nice guide, that sort of heart rate zone. And there may be some drift above it, but I think that's a easier way for me to apply my training. And then above that, that's where I maybe do like shorter reps. So for me, I basically divide the zone in half. Again, it's beneficial that we have the lab data, but I just think personally I can just slightly more have a more tailored approach to the training, because I think if I just had one big zone and I was like, okay, I'm going to go do 3 by 4 miles, I would end up just being like, well, we'll just aim for halfway anyway. So I'm like, I might as well put a zone in there, because I think that reflects the training I'm doing as well. So that's my thought. Obviously, you just keep it as just one big zone, which I think is probably the conventional way of doing it. I think that's what a lot of the established models use as well, isn't it?
I think so in general. Yeah, there's so many different type models out there, but I would say in general, I have seen examples of people splitting up the zone, but I like to keep it as one because, again, for me, my LT1 is 155. It's always what I use, and typically when it comes out as in the lab, and my LT2 is 170. So that's a 20. Well, that's a 15 beat range. So I tend to do the maths in my head. I say 25, no, 15 beat range, and that breaking that up seems like it reduces the usability. But at the same time, I get what you mean in that when I average 170 for a half marathon, I average about 165, 166 for a marathon. And when I've done 50K trail races, I'm still averaging about 160, 159 beats per minute. And that's taken me about 3 hours 20. So there is a range there in terms of how long I can sustain an average intensity across that zone. But also looking at those races, for example, I am working through the whole zone. Even in a 50K trail race, which is taking me 3 hours 20, 3 hours 30, depending on what year I'm doing it in, I'm getting to the top of that zone. I'm getting to LT2 with periods within that race. And at the end, if I'm having to really close hard. And so that is also how I typically approach sessions, in that if I am looking for a threshold session, a zone 3 session, the first few reps, I'm going to be peaking with my heart rate probably only just into LT1. And then by the end of the session, I'm getting close to 170, normally treading that fine line of hitting 170 and just trying to hold that as long as I can. As I've said already, I'm a bit guilty of, and I think a lot of people are. But I feel like for me, that is usable enough. I think trying to break it up anymore for me doesn't make sense. But then for some athletes, I can absolutely see why it would. My LT1 and LT2 were reasonably close together in terms of speeds. But if you see someone who's really untrained, or actually I say the best example of the middle distance athletes who could sometimes have like a 4 kilometer an hour gap between LT1 and LT2. So it actually becomes a huge zone. And LT1 for them still feels super easy, even though they're starting to produce some lactate. It's so submaximal in terms of percentage of VO2 max, or just in terms of their percentage of their maximal sprint speed, that is a very low, it's still a low intensity for them. There is going to be a difference in terms of how it feels, like the heart rate response, the lactate response. So I'm not completely against it. I think that's where it becomes athlete to athlete. And I think for all of the zones, you want to create something that's useful for you as an individual. And I see your thought process, and for you, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's probably the takeaway from this whole episode is like use evidence, but then use something, like make something that you're going to use, because there's no point having training zones if you just every day you look at them and you're like, oh, these don't reflect how I'm feeling and how I'm training. That's the point. The point is to better guide your training and better quantify it. So if they don't work with how you think and how you apply training, then they're not going to work, and that's why it's still, there's fairly clear like anchor points, but how you then apply them is quite individualistic, I think, because there would be people out there that could literally just use the the intensity domains, right? Like they could just use three to four zones, and be absolutely fine. And then there's people that want like 8 to 10 zones, want to be that precise. And then there's probably then a lot of people right in the middle that want 5, which is sort of generally what we have. So yeah, that's another thing. Yeah, think about how it reflects on how it works with how you train.
Absolutely. I think there's lots of ways which I think it can work. What I think doesn't work, which I think is a way you shouldn't set your zones, is some people will set like, this is a threshold zone, and by that they mean this is LT2 plus or minus 5 beats. And for me, that doesn't make sense, for the fact that you should be anchoring things around your intensity domains. And if you're spanning different intensity domains within the zone, that doesn't make sense, because you are going to get, if you are just above your LT2, you're going to see a creep in that lactate level. If you're below it, you're going to see this stabilization. So dependent upon where you are in that zone, you're going to see different responses. And I'd see that, I think that is a common, maybe not super common, but I've seen more than one example of people setting a zone which spans 2 intensity domains. So classically at LT2 plus or minus 5 beats, I would say.
I think it's done. I think it's done automatically by, I don't want to say what watch brand because I don't know, but I'm fairly certain it's an automatic one. And you see sometimes zones like it's like sub threshold, threshold, supra threshold, like these sort of like 3 zones. But then it's like I've seen it where I've like put in like what I'm saying LT2 is, and then you get these zones like mashing around it. And I don't think that's useful. Like within just a rep, like keeping your heart rate, if you're running outdoors and you're around like people and it's maybe not pancake flat, like, and there's wind and whatever else, like keeping your heart rate within 2 or 3 beats can be quite hard. I don't think that's easy to train with. So yeah, I think sometimes they're complicated for the sake of being complicated, and they don't actually hang off of these anchor points very well.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool, man. Let's move on to severe intensity domain then. So should I start off with this one?
Yeah, you might as well, because I just have one zone at this point. So
yeah, so this is where we divide. So you break up like the heavy intensity domain. I break up, but I don't. I break up the severe intensity domain. You don't do that. And again, I think it's very much dependent upon the user. What I do, to summarize, like severe is from LT2 up to VO2 max, or you could say max heart rate if you're using your heart rate zones. So we're not talking about paces, we're talking about heart rate. So for me, that spans from 170 beats per minute up to probably about 190. I have seen 190 about a year ago. Haven't raced that many 5Ks recently, which is the only time I really see that max heart rate. But yeah, so that's a 20 beat zone, but I feel like in terms of like race intensities, again, I'm using the same argument that you were making, that LT2 for me is about what I can average for a half marathon. So I can sustain my intensity for just over an hour. But then you're talking about all the way down to like 1500 meter 2K race pace. And those feel very different. And because they map onto quite a range of racing speeds, I like to break it up. And where I set that break point is just 50% of a difference, effectively. Well, actually, that's not quite true. I know I have 170 to 177 as zone 4, and then 178 to 1, and higher, effectively, as zone 5. And the reason I settled on the 177 is because I basically never see higher than that in training. Even if I'm pushing myself really, really hard, maybe I would touch 180. But I almost exclusively only get into zone 5 in a race situation, because I've got to be super fresh, also motivated enough to really, really hurt myself to get up to those heart rate zones. I can be in that zone 5 at the end of a marathon if I've paced it well and I'm super motivated. But in a 5K, I might spend 5 to 10 minutes, probably more like 5 to 7 minutes in that zone 5, even though I don't see that any time at all in training. And that's how I break it up. I think that is, for me, again, I mean, I've outlaid my reasons really. I think I'm seeing differences in terms of, can I achieve that in training, yes or no? Mapping it onto different race distances, and also links to RPE as well. I can never get to a true 10 out of 10 effort in a training session. It'll feel like a 10 out of 10, but I know that with more motivation, I could get more out of my body. And so that's how I go about breaking up that zone.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I think that makes sense. Like, that's probably the best reasoning I've heard for breaking up the zone. Because I've always thought, like, if we're saying that in this zone your heart rate is always just going to drift over time, to me, then I think like, okay, if I'm doing a session that's like maybe like, I don't know, I'm using this, I know it's the bloody like the influencer 4x4 minute session, but like, if I'm doing 4x4 minutes, I just assume my heart rate's just going to drift over time, even if the effort's the same. So even if I'm doing it on the treadmill and the like absolute effort is the same, the using heart rate as a measure of like relative effort, it's just going to drift. So I don't, to me, I've always thought, well, why is rep 3 in zone 5, but rep 1 is in zone 4? Like, that's always been my thought. But actually your thinking is probably as good, like the best reason I've heard for dividing them up, like in terms of application. And then when you come back and look at like, okay, how much time have I spent in this training zone in this block? And you can say, okay, well, those were race efforts. Like, that's actually quite useful, I think.
Yeah, I mean, when I go back and we've talked about it on Road 2 series before, we do a whole review and recap. I can see when I race just by which week did I spend time in zone 5. Sometimes zone 4 as well, because a lot of the time I'm not deliberately going to zone 4. I do so much threshold-based training, and that is how I anchor. That is my philosophy for me for most of my training. I don't need loads of stuff in zone 4 and zone 5 to improve my race performances. And that is I'd say a popular way to train now, but also I've got a really big VO2 max. My VO2 max is never going to be my limiter, and that is probably what you're trying to primarily drive by working in those zone 4 and zone 5 areas. But again, this is where there's not, let's say, right or wrong way to do it, but having some rationale, I think. And for me, it's that even when I am doing those harder sessions, I'm just not seeing heart rates above 177. And if I am, it's probably a sign for me that I'm working too hard, just because the cost benefit is not worth it. Like that risk reward, how fatigued I'm going to be after that session. Well, I might as well do a race it's going to be psychologically easier. And if I'm going that hard, then yeah, I want something to show for it in terms of a time, really, I guess, as well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I understand. Yeah. I think that's a good reason. Yeah. 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 You maybe converted me. Maybe I'm going to change the training zone.
You're adding another one.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll have 6 now. Um,
Yeah,
should we briefly mention extreme domain? I think realistically, you can't really have a heart rate zone for this domain because um, the time you spend in it, your heart rate's not actually going to catch up. It's going to be in all of the other zones as it gradually works up, right? Like I always think about, it's maybe not quite extreme domain, but if I go and do strides, I do 15-second strides. My heart rate is like so lagging behind. It's basically all below LT1, but I'm, off of GPS, but I'm running at 230, 240 a K, which is way, way, way above what I could ever hit in a VO2 max test in terms of my velocity at VO2 max. So I assume it's above the severe domain in terms of the absolute intensity, but it's not reflected in my heart rate zone. So I don't think there's a reason to even try capture the zone in from heart rate.
exactly. Yeah, like heart rate is a great reflection of intensity until you get to those intensities above VO2 max, where you can look at the heart rate dynamics. You can see that heart rate is shooting up really, really quickly. And if you're interested, that is how your GPS watches, when they give you an aerobic, they give you an aerobic and anaerobic score, don't they, on a 0 to 5? Like, what did that training session tick off? What was the stimulus there? Was it a threshold session? And that's how First Beat, which is the software company behind Garmin, goes about calculating those scores. They look at the heart rate dynamics to look at the anaerobic side of things. If heart rate is shooting up at a very, very quick rate, regardless of what actual number it gets to, that is what it's using to calculate or estimate, I would say, the anaerobic contributions to a session. Because if your heart rate is going up at such a rate, then obviously you're not able to meet those energy demands purely aerobically. And your body's doing as best it can to meet those demands really, really quickly by rapidly increasing the heart rate, but it can't achieve that. So heart rate is not it's not a way that you can capture time spent in the extreme intensity domain, really. And this is where actually I'd often differ in that if I'm giving pace zones to somebody, I would give them a zone 6. But if I'm giving them heart rate zones, I'm stopping at 5, because heart rate is just not going to be able to capture that intensity. But like you said, you can run at speeds that are well above VO2 max. And this is where a lot of, I think we could do a whole podcast topic on this idea of anaerobic speed reserve, which is this, who's the author? Gareth Sanford, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for helping me out there. This whole idea that you could also profile an athlete in terms of what's their maximal sprint speed and then where is their speed at VO2 max. And that gap in between is your speed reserve, or your anaerobic speed reserve. How much work can you do above your VO2 max? Because actually, if you look at world-class middle distance athletes, that again becomes a really big zone, because they can run 100, the best middle distance athletes in the world can run 100 meters in 11 seconds, maybe a 10 high, but their VO2 max pace is probably going to be like 15 to 16 seconds per 100. And in terms of absolute speed, that is in kilometers an hour, that's a massive difference. You're talking about going from 24 kilometers an hour, 23.5 kilometers an hour, up to 11 seconds 100. This is quick maths now. It's going to be in the ballpark of 30 kilometers an hour, isn't it?
Yeah.
Without me getting my calculator out. And practically that's quite a range. So
yeah, I was going to say as well, you sort of see it, going slightly away from endurance sports, but when you get into like invasion games like football, like part of the reason for wearing a GPS, or part of the practice we're wearing a GPS device that a lot of players wear on their backs, is that they will have their like maximal sprint speed and then they'll figure out like speed zones based off of that and quantify the time based in those zones, because heart rate doesn't capture that data. There's so many other reasons that could probably be quite an interesting podcast, but like that is part of it as well, that they're going to be measuring their heart rate, but it's not going to reflect that very brief sprint down the wing that a winger does. Like the heart rate's going to catch up 20 seconds later when they've stopped sprinting and the ball's going back the other way. But actually having the speed that they're moving is a better reflection of that work. And that's the same with this extreme domain when it comes to endurance exercise. The pace, the velocity is going to be a better indication than your heart rate.
Absolutely, yeah. And ChatGPT saved me here, and 11 seconds per 100 is 32.7 kilometers an hour. So that's a huge range in terms of speed. And although it's all in the same intensity domain, you could see reasons why, if you were, and sprinters do this, they'll talk about, speed endurance versus pure speed. But actually, it's all their training is happening pretty much in the extreme intensity domain. But the speed you can sustain for 400 meters is actually quite different to the speed you can sustain for 100. Now, us endurance runners haven't got the nuance there because we haven't got those tools in our toolbox in terms of being able to run at those speeds, or I certainly haven't anyway. But if you're a more middle distance athlete, then you probably do need to have maybe a better understanding of what is max speed and what is near max speed. But heart rate is not a great way to capture that, and I wouldn't encourage you to try. And just because your heart rate isn't getting very high in a session where you're doing strides doesn't mean you're not doing what you're achieving. And I think it's just being aware that you can run at speeds above your VO2 max, and they're not just because heart rate doesn't capture it doesn't mean that it's not a different intensity.
Yeah. Cool. I think we've covered mapping zones onto intensity domains a bit. Anything else you wanted to add?
I think that's about it for that. I think now, I thought we'd have got through that a bit quicker, to be honest, an hour and 12 minutes into recording. But I think that is the majority of the episode. But I do think there's a couple of things that we need to attach to that. And it's, what do you do with that information? You've got your zone set up. Like, what do you do with that information? And also, I've forgotten what my also was. Come back to me in a minute. How can you use that to help drive decision making, basically, and enable you to have a well structured, well balanced training program? Yeah.
I guess we've sort of covered it in the Road to Valencia series, right? In terms of our training intensity distribution, and we sort of mentioned it now. I mean, we've mentioned it on the whole series, right? I think we think that you should think about the quality sessions first. So think about the heavy and severe domain work, and then everything else falls into place around that, right? That's, although it's the least amount of time, it's the most important, maybe not most important. It's the first priority in terms of setting up your training, and then
it's going to give you most bang for your buck, isn't it? Yeah. We all know you need intensity in a program. How much intensity is probably a bit individual. Which zone you need to more target is probably a bit individual. But that is the stuff that's going to give you the most stimulus in terms of like stimulus per minute, if you want to phrase it like that. So it makes sense to anchor your stuff around that first, and then the moderate intensity domain. To an extent, do as much as you can without, while still being able to put out those good sessions and also maintain that running life balance. Because unfortunately, the vast majority of us, and probably the vast majority of the listeners, unless you're Jake Smith, are not full-time athletes. But I think just common mistakes was the second point I was trying to get to as well. Like, what do people do wrong? And I think I've alluded to it already at the start or mid episode, is that they're just not that clear about what they're trying to achieve on a given session. So going in with that notion of, right, this is what I'm going to achieve today. This is a zone 3 session. And it's not that there's anything magic about zone 3, but it's going like, this is what I'm going to achieve. This is what I want to do today. Noting down and recording, this is what I did, in terms of logging it on probably whatever software platform you use, whether it be Garmin or Strava or whatever. And then at least having that log of, right, in this block, this is what I did. Did it work or did it not? If you've just done a whole mishmash of stuff and you're not really that clear about what you've done, then it's hard to really tease apart what did work and what didn't work. So I think that is the ultimate reason why having a really well-defined zone system is useful, and using it on a day-to-day basis, because you see it a lot of it. I think you see it all the time. That you see it very commonly. People will have a great marathon block and it will all go really well. And then their next block, they try and repeat the same thing, but they don't actually know what they've done. And although they're going off the same paces, that pace now might be worth something different. It might be actually be in a different training zone. And you just see inconsistency in performances because they don't really know what they've done. They don't know what they're trying to achieve. And if you can really just take a more, I'd say, like, experimental approach to it, and I mean experimental in a scientific evidence-based approach where you're very precise about, right, this is what I'm going to do, this is how I'm going to execute it correctly, so I'm in the right domain. And then afterwards you do that review of, did it work, did I get out of that what I wanted or not, and what am I going to change next time?
That's like we said as well, that it accurately reflects like the RPE of what you're doing as well. I think you've mentioned like the sort of heavy domain work, the threshold work, but you also see it when people are, they'll say on Strava they're doing the zone 2 run, but also that at points like they're having to stop and walk, and it's probably actually that's maybe more down like your zone 1 rather than zone 2. And maybe if the zone's been like automatically generated by your watch or by Strava, it's not actually correct. And I guess another mistake is just either allow it, like being dictated by a default zone that you've never thought, okay, does this like actually pass that sort of smell test that we've mentioned? Is your threshold roughly where you run a sort of 60 to 70 minute effort at? Is where it's saying the top of zone 2 where you run, a marathon at? Like if it's saying that you ran a marathon like below LT1 and it was like a max effort sort of thing, and it was like less than 4 hours, like that's probably not right. Or if your easy runs are faster than you've like run a marathon and the zone is apparently right, that's not correct, is it? Like, it just doesn't sort of work when you take a step back and you think about it like that. So I had a question from a friend of a friend about the zones their Garmin had given them, and I just said, like, well, have you run like a marathon? Have you run a half marathon or a 10-mile? Is the heart rate data you're giving that device good? Like, is it from a chest strap or a separate arm optical strap? And then we can have a look and say, okay, did these zones like pass that smell test? Just as literally the first sort of like sift through, like, does this make any sense? If it doesn't, then you don't need to think much deeper and you can just start, changing them. But I think that's another thing as well. Just, does the zone reflect sort of the effort that it should roughly be at?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's going down like the mistakes, isn't it? Like just going off of generated zones. And I think a really nice exercise for people, if you've got good heart rate data, and by that I mean you've used a chest strap or you've got one of the optical arm straps, which are good, by the way. Just plotting, right, where is my max heart rate? Probably achieved in the end of a 5K or something like that. And then like, what did I average for a 10K? What did I average for a half marathon? What did I average for a marathon? And if you just plot duration against average heart rate, you've got a framework there to work from. You can then look at, that's going to give you a pretty much straight line, which, because I've gone and done this myself for both me and other athletes I coach, yeah, it's going to give you a pretty nice linear relationship. And you can then go, well, what could I theoretically sustain for an hour? Let's use that as LT2. And what could I sustain for 4 hours? Right, well, that's going to be my LT1. So, give or take, it's going to be there or thereabouts. And if your zones that have been auto-generated for you don't align with that very well, then I'd throw them out. And again, just if, like you said, Owain, if those zones don't map onto RPE very well, so you're a 1 out of 10 effort, but it's telling you you're in zone 3 and you need to slow down because you're going too hard. You're not. Trust your intuition. Out of the hundreds of athletes that I've had in the lab of all sort of performance levels, the vast majority were doing their easy runs in the right place. They weren't overrunning their easy runs because intuitively, the few that were very new to running and just hadn't learned about what intensities are sustainable and what are not, and what feels easy and what doesn't feel easy. Maybe some were doing more stuff in zone 2 than probably they needed to. They could probably backed off and been more in their arbitrary set zone 1. But I don't think most people find out for themselves what is about right with the easy stuff. The threshold stuff can take a bit more. You can definitely get there from just without ever stepping in the lab. And you can certainly get there by looking at just heart rate trends. But I do think it takes a bit more time to discern what is comfortably hard and what is actually, this is really quite hard. But using RPE is a great tool. And as I've said already, LT1 in 90% of the people that I test would be 5 out of 10, and LT2 is going to be about 7 out of 10 with not too much variation there. You don't see an LT2 and it's a 9 out of 10. And you don't see an LT2 and it's a 4 out of 10. Or even a 5 out of 10, I would say.
Yeah, that's probably the guide for all of it, isn't it? How does it reflect on your RPE, and does it look really not correct compared to other data you have? And then maybe the other mistake is just poor data. If you're just using the wrist heart rate, it's probably not going to be great. Like, it might be okay, and especially now I always come back to the Strava example, but like there's a DC Rainmaker video out there where his Strava predictions are completely wrong, and it's literally one data point from his Aura ring. So that's a ring that you're wearing 24/7, and it's just thrown one dodgy data point in, and the whole Strava model is broken. So that's where just literally a basic graph on Excel and drawing a line through it can show you if things are like completely wrong or not quite easily, rather than lots of big words and fancy graphics on a platform. I think as well, like it can be fairly simple. It can be as simple as you want it to be, right? I mean, like, really, it can be just RPE. Yeah.
And that's what I find more and more, to be honest. I think I've gone full circle in that I used just effort. I then learned about the different intensity domains through relying quite heavily on lactate and heart rate. And now I don't really need the heart rate and lactate to tell me what zone I'm in, because I just know how it feels. And I do think that really this is just a tool to calibrate your own RPE. You don't need to take lactates on every session.
Yeah,
I do it sometimes because it's fun. It breaks up a treadmill session, but I know how things are feeling and if this feels sustainable or not. But that has come from doing a lot of training for 15 years. And I do think that going down that route of using lactate and heart rate is a really good education piece. And I still use heart rate. I still wear a heart rate monitor for every session, because I want, for all those reasons I said earlier, I want to quantify and define what I've done in a training block and in an individual session. But when I'm executing a session, I probably don't need the heart rate there. I reckon I could have a pretty good go of just going off of not even having speed, just going off and executing a session 2 times and going, yeah, that was probably in the right place.
Yeah. Should we leave it there? Is there anything else you wanted to add?
Trying to think if there's any other more like common mistakes people make. No, I do think that, yeah, just to probably say the same thing I've said like 10 times over the last, yeah, 5 episodes, is that it just allows you to be more systematic in your training approach, having that data. And it makes you think a bit more about what you're trying to achieve as well. What's the purpose of this session? What am I trying to get out of it? Did I execute it correctly? And over the course of a training block, did I achieve the outcome that I did? And obviously, there's other factors outside of training that are going to influence was that training block successful or not. But at least then you've got a better grasp of what did you do, what was the training giving you,
Yeah.
not just having this loose idea of what you did by looking at some splits from recorded in a training diary, for example.
Yeah, yeah, that's the point of this podcast, isn't it? A systematic approach to running. And yeah, you might see people on like a lab treadmill and taking lactates and drinking all sorts of different drinks and supplements, but actually this is sort of the foundational piece, isn't it? Like, get this right, and then you can do all of that other stuff better, arguably. Yeah,
100%. I think this is science's greatest contribution to performance, to training performance, and to performance physiology. It's just having a good understanding of what different intensities are and allowing you to systematically approach your training. Like,
yeah,
the Nomeo shots, the bicarb, yeah, that's sexy and it's cool, and not saying that's not going to help your performance, but long term, just doing good structured training is going to give you a 10%, 15%, 20% improvement, not a 0.5% improvement.
yeah, yeah. I think that's a good place to leave it before
Yeah,
we just
let's
tell
leave it
everyone to
there.
use RPE.
Yeah. So yeah, just use RPE. Yeah, I do think RPE is your best tool. If I only had one, it would be RPE. That was what I'll be using. I hope you enjoyed this series for the last 5 weeks. I've really enjoyed it, and I think trying to continue along this vein of having a period of time where we really nail a particular topic is something I want to continue. So if you've got any great ideas out there, listeners, then do throw them our way. Obviously, we've got plenty of ourselves, but we want to produce stuff that you want to listen to, and some really good feedback in terms of just listenership for the last 5 weeks as well. So again, thanks for listening. Really helps us, motivates us to keep putting stuff out. If there's people that are listening to it, we'll keep making content for you. But yeah, I think that's anything else to say, Owain? Any closing remarks?
That's it for me. Yeah, enjoyed it. Been nice to research as well. I've enjoyed that, which is always a good sign. If you enjoy reading into it, it's probably going to be an interesting topic.
Absolutely. No, really cool. Good.
Catch you next time.
Thanks very much. Take care.